J.D. Vance obliterates a liberal host who tries to trap him. The bright studio lights cast long shadows across the set. J.D. Vance stood at the center, his posture confident, his eyes sharp. The table before him gleamed under the intense lights, and the audience, unseen but palpable, was waiting for the debate to unfold. The host, a well-known liberal commentator with a reputation for pressing hard on conservative figures, sat across from him, her face a picture of calm determination. It wasn't just any debate. It was a chance for J.D. Vance, a rising political star, to address the issues that had come to define his platform. His book, his political positions, and his personal journey had made him a controversial figure in American politics. But tonight, in front of a live audience, he was here to face the tough questions and, perhaps, to dismantle the narrative that had been built around him. The host, Sarah Mitchell, was known for her tough, sometimes cutting approach. She wasn't one to shy away from difficult questions, especially when it came to politicians she disagreed with. She had prepared carefully for this moment, hoping to catch J.D. off guard and expose the flaws in his political philosophy. As the interview began, Sarah started with a series of softballs. She asked J.D. about his background, his journey from Ohio to becoming a household name, and his views on the state of American politics. J.D. answered with ease, leaning into his experience as a writer, a businessman, and a political outsider. The audience seemed engaged, nodding in approval as he spoke passionately about his vision for the future of the country. But Sarah had other plans. After a few moments of polite conversation, she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. The smile on her face remained, but there was an edge to it now. The moment had arrived for the confrontation. "Mr. Vance," Sarah began, her voice measured but sharp, "you've often claimed that the political elite, particularly on the left, have failed the working class. You've spoken out about the damage done to communities like the one you grew up in. But let's be honest here, you're now part of that very elite. You've gained wealth, influence, and recognition. How can you still claim to be the voice of the working class when you've benefited so much from the system you criticize?" The question was deliberate, a calculated jab aimed at his credibility. Sarah knew that J.D. Vance's personal success, his rise from a small-town background to a position of power, was a point of contention for many. It was a classic trap: criticize him for being a success, question his authenticity, and hope to rattle him into an awkward, defensive response. The studio fell silent for a moment as the audience waited for J.D.'s reply. It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. An attempt to undermine his core message. Would J.D. Vance be able to turn this around, or would he stumble under the weight of the question? J.D. paused, but only for a brief moment. His lips curled into a subtle smile, not the kind of nervous grin that most would offer when faced with a challenge, but one that was confident and knowing. He was prepared for this. He had been anticipating it. "Well, Sarah," J.D. began, his voice steady and calm, "you're absolutely right. I'm not just a guy who came from humble beginnings. I'm someone who has succeeded within the system. But let's talk about what that success means. I didn't get here by forgetting where I came from. I didn't climb the ladder only to turn my back on the people who need real change." The audience shifted in their seats. J.D.'s response was neither defensive nor dismissive. It was direct, thoughtful, and surprisingly composed. He wasn't backing down. Instead, he was setting the stage for something bigger. "You know," he continued, "there's this narrative out there that if you rise up, if you work hard and achieve success, somehow you lose the right to speak for those who haven't had the same opportunities. But that's wrong. I didn't get to where I am by ignoring the struggles of people like me. And if I'm part of the elite, then so be it. But that doesn't change the fact that I've seen the damage that elites on both sides of the aisle have done to people like my mom, people like my neighbors, and people in the communities that have been forgotten." His words were measured, each sentence a deliberate counter to the host's accusation. The audience could feel the weight of his response, and the tension in the room thickened. Sarah Mitchell's question had been designed to make him falter, but J.D. wasn't having it. He was using the question to further solidify his point that success didn't automatically make someone out of touch with the working class. But Sarah wasn't done yet. The host knew this was her moment to try and steer the conversation, to catch JD off guard. She wasn't willing to let him get away with justifying his position so easily. "You talk a lot about elites," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "but isn't it convenient for you to criticize the system when you've become a part of it? You've spoken out against tech companies, but you've also profited from them. Doesn't that make you just as complicit in the very system you're railing against?" JD's smile remained, but there was a new intensity in his gaze. He was used to this kind of criticism, and he wasn't about to be caught in a trap. His response would be deliberate, and he knew exactly how to answer. Sarah Mitchell, sensing a slight crack in the veneer of J.D. Vance's polished composure, leaned in even further. Her eyes narrowed with an intensity that could cut glass. This wasn't just about asking questions anymore, this was a battle for control, and she wasn't about to let J.D. off the hook so easily. The lights above them flickered for a brief moment, but the tension in the room remained thick. Sarah had given J.D. a moment to explain his rise, but now it was time to press. She'd been trained for this, to push, to provoke, and to expose the cracks in even the most composed individuals. And J.D. Vance, she was sure, had cracks. "You've made your fortune, J.D., Sarah said, her voice sharper now, but it's not just about making money, is it? It's about what you do with that influence. You've positioned yourself as a voice for the disaffected, for those left behind by the very system you've benefited from. So, tell me, how do you reconcile that?" J.D. didn't immediately respond, his gaze steady and unbroken. He understood exactly what Sarah was doing. She was trying to corner him, trying to make him seem hypocritical, using his own success against him. But J.D. had walked this path before. He had faced much harsher critics than Sarah, and he knew how to navigate these conversations. "Well, Sarah," J.D. finally replied, his tone calm but firm, "let me ask you something. Do you really believe the only way to help people is by staying in the trenches with them, by making the same choices that led them to the same place? I don't think that's true. I think you can fight for change and fight for people without living exactly like they do." There was a slight pause as Sarah absorbed his words. She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her. J.D. wasn't flustered, he was responding with the same calculated precision that had defined his rise. "The truth is," J.D. continued, "I'm here because I know what it's like to grow up in a place where hope is hard to come by. I'm here because I understand what it's like to feel abandoned by both the left and the right. I made it out, and I'm fighting to make sure others have the same opportunity." He leaned forward slightly, making sure to keep his voice steady but insistent. "But, to your point, yes, I'm successful. And yes, I've made money. But I've used that success to keep pushing for the very changes that can make a real difference for those left behind. I'm not trying to ignore the system. I'm trying to change it. If that makes me part of the elite, then I guess I'll wear that badge proudly." J.D.'s confidence was undeniable. It wasn't the arrogance that many expected, it was the confident assurance of someone who had already weathered far worse storms than this. He wasn't just defending his position, he was redefining it, making it clear that success didn't disqualify him from advocating for change. But Sarah wasn't ready to relent. "You talk a big game about change, J.D., she pressed, but when it comes to action, there's always a catch. You criticize tech companies, but you've made your wealth off of them. You claim to be against the establishment, but you're part of it now. Aren't you just playing the game everyone else plays, just with a different spin?" It was a harsh jab, one designed to make J.D. seem like just another cog in the same corrupt machine. Sarah's tone had become sharper, her voice full of accusation. She was leaning heavily on the hypocrisy angle now, hoping to land a blow that would force J.D. to falter. J.D.'s response was slow and deliberate, as though he were choosing his words carefully. The audience was hanging on every syllable, waiting for him to either crumble or counter with a powerful retort. "You're right, Sarah," J.D. said, with an almost imperceptible smile, "I've made money off of tech. But I've never once pretended that I didn't. I've been upfront about it. But let's not confuse success with selling out. The words hung in the air, and Sarah's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the challenge JD had just posed. "I've been a part of this system," JD continued, his voice unwavering. "I've worked in it, I've earned from it. But that doesn't mean I've sold my soul. That doesn't mean I've stopped fighting for the very people who are ignored by the politicians and billionaires on both sides of the aisle." His tone was cooler now, more authoritative, as he leaned back in his chair and met Sarah's gaze head-on. "So yes, I may be part of the system. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop calling out the people who've been responsible for the problems we face. If anything, it means I have a better seat at the table to get things done." Sarah paused. Her eyes narrowed, not in irritation, but in a growing realization. JD was no longer simply defending his position. He was dismantling hers, piece by piece. She had thought she could trap him with accusations of hypocrisy, but JD wasn't taking the bait. He was turning every question, every accusation, back on her with laser precision. The tension in the room had escalated. The audience was no longer just watching an interview, they were watching a battle of wits, a moment where J.D. Vance was systematically dismantling the very arguments Sarah had set up to trap him. But Sarah wasn't finished. The host was determined to get J.D. to make a misstep. The air was thick with the sense that something explosive was about to happen. "Let me ask you one more thing, J.D., Sarah said, her voice now dripping with a mix of challenge and disdain. "You keep saying you want to help those left behind, but let's be honest. Isn't the real goal here to help yourself? The political game is full of ambitious individuals who don't care about the people they claim to represent. How are you any different?" J.D. Vance's eyes hardened, and for the first time, the smile that had barely left his face faded. He leaned forward slightly, his posture shifting to something more intense, more assertive. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, fell into an almost eerie silence. Sarah Mitchell had just asked the question she hoped would finally force JD to show his hand, the one question that would expose him as nothing more than another self-serving politician. But JD wasn't about to fall into her trap. He had seen these tactics before, and he knew exactly how to handle them. "You know, Sarah," JD began slowly, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "that's the thing. People like you always try to make this about ambition. You assume that because I've made something of myself, because I'm in this position, I must be in it for personal gain. You think I'm just like all the other politicians, that I'm out here playing the same game that everyone else is." He paused, allowing the words to settle in. The tension in the room was palpable. JD's tone was controlled, but there was an edge to it now. The facade of politeness was gone, he was speaking from a place of deep conviction, and everyone could feel it. "Well, here's the thing," JD continued, his voice steady, each word deliberate, "I'm not like the politicians you're used to seeing. I didn't spend my life trying to climb the ladder to become part of the establishment. I fought my way out of poverty. I fought my way out of a broken system. And now that I've made it, I'm not going to apologize for it. But don't mistake that for selfishness." Sarah's expression tightened, clearly caught off guard by JD's firm response. She had expected him to backpedal, to justify his actions with typical politician speak. But JD wasn't playing by those rules. He wasn't going to give her what she wanted. Instead, he was turning the narrative back on her, and he knew it. "I'm here because I've seen the consequences of a system that's failed working-class families. A system that leaves people behind, while the elite keep making money off their backs. You think I'm here for personal ambition? Let me tell you something. If I wanted to get ahead at the expense of others, I'd be doing something a lot less controversial. But I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself." The audience could feel the gravity of his words. JD wasn't just defending his success, he was challenging the very assumptions people had made about him. The air was thick with the sense that the conversation was about to take a sharp turn. "See," JD went on, "this isn't about me. It's about the people who've been ignored for decades. It's about those who've been told that their struggles don't matter. I don't need a career in politics to feel validated. I'm doing this because I want to make sure that people like me, the ones who came from nothing, have a shot at something better. So don't tell me I'm just another ambitious politician. I'm not here for the same reasons they are." Sarah Mitchell seemed to recoil slightly. She had tried to trap JD by painting him as a typical career politician. She'd hoped to get him to reveal some trace of ambition or greed, something that could undermine his authenticity. But instead, she was met with a man who wasn't just defending himself, he was exposing the flaws in her argument. The host, now visibly rattled, quickly regained her composure. She wasn't going to let him have the last word, not yet. But JD had already seized the momentum. The audience could feel the shift in the room. The liberal host, who had been so confident just moments ago, was now on the defensive. "You make a compelling argument, JD," Sarah said, her voice now tinged with a hint of frustration. "But what I still don't understand is how you can claim to be for the people when you've been part of the system that perpetuates the very issues you're fighting against. You're sitting here, telling us you're different, but your wealth and your connections are all tied to the same corporate interests you rail against. How do you reconcile that?" JD leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but with an air of quiet authority. He had been anticipating this exact question, and now it was his turn to really turn the tables. "I'll tell you how I reconcile it," he said slowly, his voice cool and unwavering. "I don't pretend to be perfect. I don't claim to have all the answers. But what I do know is that I'm using my position to call out the very same people who've taken advantage of this system for far too long. And when you're willing to risk everything to do that, you get a different perspective. I may be part of the system, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten who I'm fighting for." JD's words were sharp, cutting through the air with precision. There was no ambiguity in his response. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't trying to paint himself as a hero. He was simply stating the truth that Sarah and her colleagues were reluctant to face, that change often comes from within the system, not from outside it. Sarah's next words were slower, measured as if she were trying to regain her footing. "But what about the people who say you've sold out? That you've become just another voice for the establishment you claim to oppose?" JD's response came without hesitation. "Let me tell you something," he said, locking eyes with her. "You can criticize me all you want for being successful. You can try to paint me as part of the problem. But at the end of the day, I'm still here fighting for the people who have been ignored for far too long. And if that makes me part of the establishment in your eyes, then I'll wear that label. But it won't stop me from fighting for change." The room went silent. JD's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah Mitchell knew, at that moment, she had lost the initiative. The audience felt the weight of his response. There was no denying it, JD Vance had taken control of the conversation. Sarah's eyes flicked to the camera, then back to JD. She had no comeback, no way to continue pressing him without sounding like she was simply repeating herself. JD had turned the debate around in a way that left her scrambling for a new angle. It was clear that the battle was far from over, but the power dynamic had shifted. JD Vance had just delivered his most powerful blow yet, and it had left Sarah Mitchell stunned. The moment hung in the air like the calm before a storm. The audience could feel the shift, the power dynamics visibly altering as JD Vance's response hit its mark. The host, Sarah Mitchell, was momentarily speechless, struggling to regain control of the conversation. She had been prepared for a combative, defensive JD, but what she got instead was a calm, deliberate, and razor-sharp response that not only defended his position but obliterated her carefully laid trap. JD Vance sat back, his expression unchanged, as if the confrontation had been nothing more than another day at the office. His hands rested on the table, his posture relaxed yet commanding. There was no trace of nervousness or anxiety in his demeanor. He had been here before. He had faced far worse opponents than Sarah Mitchell, and he had always walked away victorious. Sarah shifted in her seat, her face now flushed with frustration. She had expected JD to be rattled, perhaps defensive or even apologetic. Instead, he had turned every accusation, every assumption, back on her with chilling precision. And now, she found herself caught in a corner of her own making. It wasn't just the question itself that had backfired. It was the way JD had dismantled the underlying assumption that his success, his wealth, and his political position made him one of them, part of the very system he was so critical of. JD had turned the question into an indictment of the very system Sarah and others like her claimed to support. He had become the voice of the people in the room, not the wealthy elites, and Sarah had failed to make him falter. But Sarah wasn't about to admit defeat. The stakes were too high, and the cameras were rolling. There was still time for her to recover, to attempt to regain the narrative. But JD could feel the momentum in his favor, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he sealed his victory. Without missing a beat, Sarah tried to regain control. "I hear what you're saying, JD," she began, her voice strained but still trying to carry authority. "But you talk about fighting for the people, for the working class. Yet you've positioned yourself in such a way that you benefit from the very corporate interests you criticize. Can you honestly say you're still fighting for those people when you've made your fortune off the very system you claimed to oppose?" It was clear that Sarah was going back to the same line of attack, hoping that her persistence might eventually find a crack in JD's armor. But this time, JD didn't flinch. He didn't take the bait. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing as he looked directly at Sarah. "You know, this is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice low but with a biting edge. "You keep asking me about my success, my wealth. But what you're really asking is whether I'm one of them. You want me to apologize for being successful, for climbing out of the mess that people like you keep enabling. But I'm not going to apologize for that. You can't silence me by pointing out my success, Sarah. If anything, my success gives me the platform to say what needs to be said." JD's words were deliberate, cutting to the core of Sarah's repeated criticisms. There was no defensive posture, no backpedaling. Just a brutal truth. He wasn't going to back down, and he wasn't going to let her twist his words into something they weren't. "I'm not part of the establishment because I made money," JD continued, his voice growing more passionate. "I'm part of it because I'm using that success to challenge the people who've been holding power for too long, people who think they can control the narrative, control the future. I'm here to change that. I'm not like the corporate-backed politicians you're used to. I'm not here to toe the line. And no amount of questions about my elitism is going to change that." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but JD wasn't finished. He had built up too much momentum now, and the words were flowing from him with the kind of certainty that comes from a man who has made his peace with the fight ahead. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore, it was about sending a message. "You know, this entire interview has been about trying to discredit me, trying to make me out to be just another politician, just another guy who's out for personal gain. But let me tell you something, the people I'm fighting for don't care about my wealth. They care about their families, their jobs, their futures. And I'm not going to stop fighting for them just because people like you want to make me look bad." There was a brief pause as JD let the weight of his words settle over the room. Sarah was struggling now. She could feel the tide turning. JD had managed to do the one thing she hadn't expected. He had managed to turn her attack into his greatest strength. "You can keep questioning my motives," JD continued, his voice unwavering, "but at the end of the day, the people who support me know exactly what I stand for. And that's why they're behind me. I'm not here to play the game. I'm here to change the game. And no matter how many times you try to twist it, that's not going to change." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah sat back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the weight of JD's response, and for the first time in the interview, she seemed to be at a loss for words. JD had turned the tables once again, and this time, he wasn't just defending himself. He was obliterating the entire premise of the interview. The audience, sensing the shift, couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for JD's ability to maintain control and push back against the narrative Sarah had tried to build. He wasn't just answering questions, he was dictating the terms of the debate. And as the interview progressed, it was becoming increasingly clear that JD Vance wasn't just surviving this confrontation, he was winning it. The final moments of the interview were upon them, and the room felt like it was vibrating with tension. J.D. Vance had delivered the final blow, and now the host, Sarah Mitchell, was left grappling for a way to recover. But it was clear, the conversation had shifted beyond her control. The carefully crafted questions she had hoped would catch him off guard had been turned against her with such precision that she could no longer regain the upper hand. Sarah sat there, still trying to maintain her composure, but the weight of JD's words seemed to loom over her like a shadow. She had entered the interview expecting to expose JD's contradictions, to trap him into admitting his hypocrisy. Instead, she had found herself outmatched by a man who wasn't just defending his position, he was turning the entire debate on its head. She cleared her throat, a subtle attempt to regain the focus. "Well, JD," she said, her voice a little less confident than before, "you've certainly made your position clear. But let's face it, the criticism won't stop. You'll continue to face pushback from both sides. And no matter what you say here, people are still going to question your motives." JD leaned back in his chair, the calm confidence still radiating from him. He wasn't done. This was the final round, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. "Sarah," he began slowly, "people are always going to question my motives. That's part of being in this arena. The real question is whether or not my actions align with what I've said. And the answer to that is yes. I'm not here to appease people who don't care about the real issues. I'm here to fight for those who have been ignored and cast aside by the system. That's what matters to me." His words were unwavering, and the truth in them was undeniable. As JD spoke, the audience in the studio seemed to feel the weight of his conviction. He wasn't here to play the game. He wasn't here to win over the elites or the media. He was here for something bigger. And for the first time, it seemed as though Sarah Mitchell and everyone watching had begun to realize just how unshakable JD's stance truly was. "You can keep questioning me," JD continued, his voice becoming more resolute. "You can keep trying to paint me as just another politician. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm speaking out against the very system that's hurt people like me. I'm here because I want to make a difference. And no amount of pushback is going to stop me." Sarah, now visibly struggling, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had no response. No comeback. The fight was over, and JD had decisively won. She could continue to ask questions, but it was clear that JD had already taken the narrative and twisted it into something entirely different. She could try to frame him as a hypocrite, but the truth was, he had exposed the hypocrisy of the system, and of the very people who claimed to hold the moral high ground. "Well," Sarah said, finally, her voice tinged with frustration, "I think we'll have to leave it there for today. You've certainly given us a lot to think about." JD smiled slightly, leaning back again as he met her gaze. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his tone light but still carrying the same conviction. "Because what matters is what people do with that information. It's not just about what I say, it's about the change I'm fighting for. And whether they like it or not, that's not going away." The interview ended with Sarah nodding stiffly, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. But as the cameras switched off and the audience began to disperse, there was a palpable sense that the story of this debate was far from over. J.D. Vance had not only outsmarted the host, he had made sure that his message, his purpose, and his determination were clear. The media would continue to spin their narratives, the critics would keep questioning him, but J.D. had given them something to think about. And in that, he had won. Outside the studio, the fallout began almost immediately. Clips from the interview started to circulate, and the response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with discussions, memes, and debates about what had just happened. Supporters rallied behind JD's unapologetic stance, while critics scrambled to find a way to spin his message as anything but genuine. But the reality was that JD had solidified his position, not just as a politician, but as a figure who was unafraid to confront the system head-on. In the weeks that followed, the interview would go viral. News outlets covered it relentlessly, dissecting every moment, every line. But in the end, one thing remained clear: J.D. Vance had not only survived the interview, he had obliterated the liberal host's attempt to trap him. He had proved that he was not just another politician. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the vision, the conviction, and the courage to change the political landscape, no matter the cost. And as the final reports came in, it became evident that J.D. Vance's rise had only just begun. The host, Sarah Mitchell, may have walked away from the interview with a bruised ego, but J.D. had emerged stronger, more determined, and more ready than ever to take on the world.